Before I start, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge one of Papa's. I know Mama did mention her, Auntie Blanche Laguma, sitting in the audience. If you could just stand for a second. And Auntie Blanche turned 90 last year. And then there's another uncle just next to there, Uncle Padiachi, if you can stand. 92 years old. Thank you. Okay, you can sit. Thank you very much. I will acknowledge later on Auntie Blanche's contribution in the movement that Papa belonged to. Now, let me just start right at the beginning. Papa was born in a village in Kakamas, in a little village called Sali. And it was situated just on the other side of the Orange River in the Northern Cape. He was one of 6 sons and 4 daughters. Is that right, Uncle Nick? 6 sons and 4 daughters. And of our great-grandfather and grandmother, Jan Johannes Bock, a farmer, and Francina Bock, nee Versaghi, a teacher. She was a homeschool teacher. So she also left a legacy of teachers in the family. After completing his matric in 1945, Papa went to Dower College in the Eastern Cape to pursue a career in teaching. When Papa completed his studies, he went back to the Northern Cape, settling in Uppington, where he taught at a farm school for a year, and later for 5 years at the Congregational Church School. It was during this time that Papa played rugby for a fearful rugby team called the Desert Rats. He played at wing and sometimes hooker. So Papa didn't just make his mark in the church and in politics, but also in sport. And if you speak to any of the top rugby players in the Northern Cape, they will come from this team. Both Papa and Uncle Nick played for the Desert Rats. In 1955, Papa came to Cape Town and furthered his teaching career at Zonnebloem Training College. And during this time, he was a member of the Teachers and Education Professional Association, TEPA, and the Teachers League of South Africa, TLSA. It was perhaps an incident during high school which set Papa on a path of resistance and activism. Papa's high school teacher, who was a more progressive individual of his time, was away from school on an education workshop, on a program that took him away for a few days from the school. And in his absence, the acting principal, who was more support of the state and its divisive policies, had drawn up a petition against the existing principal and against his colleague, for all his peers and senior students to sign and support. Papa refused to sign this document. And word got around in the Northern Cape about this young man who refused to sign this document. And quickly, other students and teachers took the example of Papa and refused to sign this statement in the absence of the existing principal. So perhaps as a high school student, I think it could have been earlier, but I think this is where Papa started actively getting involved and making a stand for people who otherwise would have been sidelined either through agents provocative or through the state itself. So Papa finds himself in the Cape in 1955, where he settles in a boarding house in Kleinenoverstraat in District 6. It is during this period that Papa meets other activists such as Barney de Size, George Peak, Isaiah Stein, Alex and Blanche Laguma, Wilfred and Dennis Brutus, and there's a host of other activists that Papa works with during this time. And I just want to add that Dennis Brutus is, with the help of the anti-apartheid movement overseas, is the person that started the campaign to get South Africa kicked out of the Olympics and international sport. So, which was a good thing. There was a lot of sacrifices to be made with this move. Even in our own family, we had very good athletes, footballers. My brother, my eldest brother, at the age of 17, became one of the top athletes in the country. And in fact, although it's disputed, ran a 4-minute mile when Dani Malan, the white athlete, was struggling to run a sub 4-minute mile. So there were only about 3 people in the world that were running sub 4-minute miles. And Harold, my eldest brother, is sitting here somewhere. Yes, there. Made a huge sacrifice with his dad and said, if South Africa is out of international sports, that's it. We'll do it for fun. Many of us did that. But anyway, we're honoring Papa, so I just want to go on. So in 1963, Papa issued papers by the apartheid said, becoming the first anti-apartheid activist in the Western Cape to be placed under banning order. What a banning order is basically an interdict signed by a magistrate that restricts you to do certain things, to meet certain people. In fact, he couldn't meet with more than 2 people. The other thing was that he had to seek permission anytime he wanted to do something. He wanted to go to a funeral, and at the same time, he was stopped from teaching. At the same time, he was stopped from teaching in 1963. So they took away his degree, and Papa then was not under house arrest yet, but the restrictions were so severe that he may as well have been under house arrest. And so he had to sign on every Wednesday morning and every Saturday morning at the police station. Now, I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity to look at some of the images. There's some very happy images and memories. And then there's a few images on the screen. One is a letter that the state sent Papa. And then there's another one you'll see. There's a few funeral images when our sister passed away. So Papa had to get permission to visit the gravesite and even to go to funerals. And immediately after those visits, he had to go to the Woodstock police station and sign a register. So these restrictions were severe. You know, that is just a few of the restrictions I spoke about. Others were that he couldn't meet with other banned personalities or people who were under banning order. He couldn't belong to organizations. It didn't matter whether those organizations were sports organizations, political organizations, or even the church. So he could just not belong to any organization where he was going to mix freely with more than 2 people. So, in 1965, Papa was hauled in front of the court for breaking these restrictions. Basically what happened, and I recently was fortunate while doing research on Papa to find the court papers, which is very interesting because the court papers describes word for word what happened. And they hold Papa in front of court, charged him with 7 charges, and the state wanted 2 years for every charge. So Papa would have gone to Robben Island, spent 14 years on Robben Island. And the rule then was that if you were sentenced for more than 2 years, you'd go to Robben Island. And if you were sentenced for less, you would be sent to one of the local prisons. So the interesting thing about that case was that they had 8 of Papa's comrades as state witnesses. And 3 of Papa's comrades decided that they were not going to testify against Papa. And basically, the three, I'm just going to acknowledge those three. I'm not going to talk about the all 8. Those three were Isaac Isi Heyman, Dennis Wessels, and Ahmad Osman. And I'm going to single out Ahmad Osman because Isaac Heyman and Dennis Wessels didn't give reasons to testify except to say that they won't testify against their comrade. But Ahmad Osman, who was a teacher in Athlone, told the state and the judge and the state prosecutor that there was no way he was going to testify against someone he considers his friend. And he cited an example of a teacher that testified against one of his friends. And the next week when he came to school, a rat had been drawn on the blackboard with his name under it. And the whole school, all the students and his peers sidelined him. So he cited that example, and amongst other examples, that his community would sideline him, and his family would disown him, and his son, who was only about 10 years old, had a talk with him, and his son told him, I will disown you if you testify against Uncle William. So, what happened to these three gentlemen then was that they was, and Ahmad Osman said, I don't care what the court does to me, whether they send me to prison or what they do to me, but this is my stand. So they were all sentenced to 12 months in prison. Papa had already spent a lengthy period in jail, spending time, I don't know if Papa was in Central, but Papa spent some time in Woodstock Police Station, and as a waiting trial prisoner, he was at Paulsmoor. And Gina tells a very sad story about how we went to go and visit. I cannot remember it, but Gina always tells a story about how all of us went to go and visit Papa in Paulsmoor. And there was this high wall between Papa and us. And we couldn't see Papa. Everybody had to jump. The children all had to jump so that they could see Papa for a brief few seconds. And then it was all over and we had to all go home again, you know. But anyway, so these 7 charges, they couldn't prove it because the state witnesses, who some of them were Papa's comrades, their story wasn't credible. So eventually they only got Papa on 1 charge, which the state wanted 3 years for that 1 charge. I think that the judge was very lenient, because when I read the transcripts of the court proceedings, I can see he questions Papa about Papa's life and Papa's children and Papa's career, and he feels very sorry for Papa, and he refuses to give Papa these 3 years, and eventually sentences Papa to 9 years, including the period that Papa was in jail for as an awaiting trial prisoner. And Papa then goes to serve his sentence in Victor Verster, where Mandela served his last few years, in this political section called Switzerland. Now it was called Switzerland because it was opposite the criminal section, and it faced those mountains beyond Paul. And in winter, those mountains was covered in snow. So the political prisoners called it Switzerland. And so Papa spent his time there, and when Papa came out of prison, he was placed under house arrest with his banning restrictions. So this became worse. In 1974, we moved out to Lansdowne from Home Estate. We were all living in my grandmother's house in Home Estate. We moved out to Lansdowne, and Papa couldn't come stay by us. And Mama had to write quite a number of letters to the authorities that time, the Minister of Police, John Foster, and pleaded to his good conscience as a Christian to allow Papa to come and stay with us. Now, in terms of Papa's contribution as a freedom fighter and as a socially conscious individual, he'd done a lot more after he eventually came to stay with us. There was a time when he ran an adult education program in Valhalla Park amongst the church people who were mostly illiterate. Some of them couldn't read and write, eventually being able to read and write and sign their names. Papa, up until a few years ago, was running programs to skill people. Papa and Mama, in fact, so I mustn't forget Mama in this. They were running a program up in the past Klein Willem, in the area they were living, called Sienada, a group which empowered people as artists and creative people. And when Papa came home, ran a similar program with Eula and her husband in the Athlone district, empowering people in the creative arts. So up until maybe the age of 88, Papa was still busy doing work in the community. And for Papa's children and great-grandchildren and the visitors here, that is an amazing testimony to carry with you and an amazing example to look up to, you know. So before I finish, I just want to, I know Mama spoke about some of the stuff, Eula also spoke about some of the stuff, but I just want to talk about when Papa came to Groenvlei. When Papa came to Groenvlei, the first thing he did was he had these huge grounds and he started planting and making a garden. And Anton, my older brother, and myself were still at school in District 6. So Papa used to come and pick us up in the evening. And Papa used to drive us around District 6 and we'd collect rubble. And we'd collect rocks. And there's a few images in the presentation where you can see our house. And there's a pathway leading up to the front of our house. That pathway was built from the rubble and rocks of District 6. And so was the driveway where the cars drove into the driveway, and also the two rockeries in the garden. So for me, there was always this thing, you know, later on, much later, that maybe what Papa did was like a homecoming, because Papa, when he came to settle in Cape Town first, he lived in District 6. So maybe this, going to collect those rocks and putting it up his pathway, was a reminder of him coming home, you know. He wasn't allowed to come to his house for a number of months before the government gave him. What actually happened was, Papa was restricted to the magisterial district of Cape Town. So when we moved to Lansdowne fell in the magisterial district of Wynberg. So they had to change those restrictions so that he could come and live with his family. So for me, that is very poignant that Papa had collected all these rocks and stuff in District 6 and built his driveway and his pathway to his house, to the front of his house, with these rocks, you know. Because after all, the first time he came to Cape Town was in District 6. And so the first time he came home, maybe he wanted to have a reminder. I don't know, Papa, but that's how I like to see it. And then the other thing about, which Eula spoke about Papa having devotion every night and reading and studying. Papa used to have this knack. And sometimes I picked it up in those art classes and art competitions. Eula didn't mention the art competitions. And sometimes the whole community used to come and join us in these competitions. And in these readings that we used to have in the evenings, Papa would read a story, and it would be a simple story. A nursery school story. But he'd take the issues out of the story and turn it into the issues of the day and allow us to debate those issues. And I think this also kept Papa sane to a degree, not being able to meet with other people and meet in platforms where you could have lively debate. He created that amongst his children every night. And on a Saturday when he had art classes, he would try and create a theme that was very socially important, so that he could, maybe influence isn't the right word, but he could open up our minds, you know. So that's a few of the things that during this period that I can recall about Papa. And I just want to say, Papa and Mama, you have left a great legacy. A very difficult legacy for anybody to follow, but a great example for us to look to in our moment for a beacon. So, long live William Bock. Long live Cecilia Bock. Thank you, Papa. Thank you, Mama.